I managed to somehow overcome my shyness because I say, actually, I want to be here.
Yeah. I think it's super good for us. So hi everyone, we're here at the New York Institute of Technology today. I'm a student here, a graduate student at the Urban Design program. Jeffrey is my professor. Jeffrey is a FAIA LEED architect. He's been involved in both research, teaching, and also practitioner. He's associate professor and director from our program here, the graduate program in urban and regional design. He's a specialist in sustainable and resilient urban design, whose research is applied in professional practice and disseminated through the profession, government, and allied disciplines. As director of the graduate program in urban and regional design, he has shaped the program to engage the fluid, interdisciplinary, and global urban design profession that is practiced in the 21st century. His professional practice focuses on U.S. international urban design projects and knowledge transfer. Projects in the Arabian Gulf, India, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, and the United States include low carbon communities, green buildings, and smart growth. Jeffrey contributes to the development of the U.S. and international sustainable resilient guideline metrics, including STAR communities, the Global Aqua District Protocol, and McKinsey's Green District and Urban Land Institute Technical Assistant Panel. A lot. His work expands to the traditional influence and capabilities of architect urbanists by bridging climate science, policy, and design practice. Jeffrey, maybe you want to...
Sure. So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thank you for the kind introduction, Luciano, who is our program at NYT here in Manhattan. If you could look out the window from here, you would see this view of Central Park. Is a 3-semester program. It's for post-professional degree students, so they've all received their degrees in landscape architecture and to a certain degree planning. We have a large international student body, and Luciana comes to us from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. We are really pleased to talk today about not only the work that we're doing here, the research work that we're doing here at the university on the intersection of urban form and climate, which is really an area of specialization that I've had for some time, coming from a practice background and also an academic and research background. So today we're just going to have a conversation, right? And you'll ask me some questions, and I might actually ask you a few questions too.
Yeah, okay.
And that'll be good. And then, of course, really eager to engage with the viewers if they have any questions too, and if they want to try to explore some of these issues, these critical issues. I just want to sort of emphasize 2 publications that are kind of a genesis for this conversation. One is an op-ed that I wrote recently for Forbes magazine, and I think it's linked, there's a link to it on the Facebook page, but it's called To Climate Change, Cities Need the Right Design, and that was published in, when was it? In
December last year.
Okay, December. And the second is this monster publication that has just come out and actually is being published currently by Cambridge University Press. And it's the second assessment report on climate change in cities, and it's a peer-reviewed publication. And I'm coordinating lead author of the chapter on urban planning and urban design. So I encourage you all to order this book, and it's also going to come out on a digital version as well, so you don't have to throw out your back by carrying it. But it's a terrific, essentially a snapshot of the science and bridging to practice with respect to urban climate. And so with that, maybe we can have this kind of back and forth conversation.
So I'll be asking Jeffrey some questions, mostly about the article on Forbes magazine, but I encourage you guys to please make questions, make comments on Facebook. We're going to be reading them in the end. So please like us, share us, and make your questions. We're going to be going through them in the end.
Great.
So to start, Jeffrey, I'd like to ask you, why are you interested in this intersection of urban design and climate?
The intersection of urban design and climate. Well, I mean, I think that there's sort of two sets of ways of answering that question. Why am I interested? First of all, it's no secret that there are two global challenges that we're facing. Number one is around the massive urbanization that is occurring all around the world, and especially in the global south, where 2/3 of the world's population is expected to live in cities by 2050. So that's going to take that's going to put a huge amount of strain on cities around the world, on their infrastructure. It's going to densify cities, so there's going to be much more population in a small amount of space. And at the same time, there is a phenomenon and climate change that is real and is actually a major challenge for cities with respect to urban heat, flooding, kinds of issues of flooding. And as you know, during COP21 that happened in Paris just a couple of years ago, the focus there was on ensuring that we do not exceed 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. So, and if we do, we're going to be creating a domino effect, with respect to climate chaos and emergencies around the world. So, I think that those two sort of factors of mass urbanization and climate change are will be causing a huge challenge. And I think that that's an area for 21st century urban design. I mean, I think that that's going to be really a central focus. And you, Luciano, who comes from Brazil, you are experiencing these kinds of mass urbanizations as well. And of course, the flooding that you're seeing in your own cities has been exacerbated. So that's one way to answer that question. The second way to answer that question, it's a long-winded answer, is that I had a sort of epiphany, if you will, just a few years ago, maybe 5-10 years ago. I worked for most of my career in practice. So I've always taught, but I've always had a foot in academia, but primarily I was in practice. And I worked on some, as you know, some big projects, both in the United States and internationally. And particularly internationally, I worked in some harsh climates, very difficult climates. At the same time, we were trying to develop urban centers that were sustainable, and in some cases actually zero carbon. Many of you might be aware of the project in Abu Dhabi called Masdar, and I was working on that project for a couple of years. That's taking place in the desert, so the context is very difficult to achieve low carbon development. So I realized that we had to sort of, first of all, learn from pre-industrial cities, learn some lessons on how they were able to essentially live in some degree of harmony with a very harsh climate, using different techniques that we can certainly learn from. I mean, they were very smart techniques to live in that kind of harmony. So many of you are aware of desert communities around the world. the thick walls, the adobe kind of construction, the sort of narrow streets for self-shading, things of that nature, maximizing urban ventilation, using wind towers, those kinds of techniques. So that was certainly something that I thought about with respect to, how could those lessons be brought to a contemporary metropolis? I mean, it's one thing to talk about pre-industrial cities, but what about Rio de Janeiro, New York City, Paris, Mumbai, and those kinds of cities? So that was kind of a question that I had at that time. The second epiphany, two epiphanies, the second one was when I got interested in the intersection of, in urban climatology, essentially, in the science of urban climatology. Because we've all heard about urban climate scientists, but these tend to be very sort of, especially climate scientists, are dealing at a regional level. They're really at a regional and even national level. So they're looking at really macro scale. And the urban climatologists are looking at much more granular scale at the city level. So I was naturally very interested in the lessons that I could learn from these climatologists, these scientists. And so I did quite a bit of research about that because, of course, I was working in these kinds of projects internationally in harsh climates. How could I bridge between that urban climate science and the practice that I was doing? And what I found when I was sitting around the table, and I was the only urban designer or architect sitting around the table surrounded by climate scientists, was that they talked a lot about issues around urban morphology, three-dimensional form. They talked about vegetative cover from a scientific perspective. Vegetative cover, they talked about building materials and thermal mass. They talked about anthropogenic emissions, which are human-caused emissions from automobiles, etc. And I thought to myself, this is what we do as urban designers. We are very engaged in these very issues of urban form, parks, of course, linear parks. We're engaged in building materials, obviously as architects, and also on sustainable building and strategies with respect to, say, minimizing the effect of the automobile in our cities. So these were like natural allies for us in a certain sense. So, and I know I talked to you a lot about this in class in our design studios, and I think that there was an opportunity when I came and spoke to these urban climatologists. They were very eager to engage with architects and urban designers because we could help them to develop case studies, prototypes essentially, that are essentially illustrating the effects of their science a certain way.
Maybe also working as a bridge between science and design?
Absolutely. And so that's an area that I'm very interested in, and I know that the students have been exposed to that. And I mean, even our midterm design review, because we're doing in our second semester, which is right now, we're in the midst of it, we're doing something called the Urban Climate Lab. That's our second semester urban design studio. And our Urban Climate Lab, we brought in who? We brought in cross-disciplinary jury, right?
Yeah, like all kinds of juries.
Yeah.
I mean, from architects, lawyers, we had all kind of
climate scientists.
Climate scientists,
we had someone
for sure.
from NASA.
Urban designers.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, we had policymakers, right, who are from the government, the city government. So this is an area that is naturally very multidisciplinary. Of course, urban design is a multidisciplinary practice, and so, in a sense, that was a natural action. And so our final review will be bringing again this type of jury back to the student reviews. So anyway, that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but
that's fine. That's good.
okay.
So when you're introducing yourself and talking a little bit how and why you got here, you talk about cities most of the time.
Yeah.
So why do you think that cities should be at the forefront of combating climate change? Are urban areas better or worse for the environment? What is their role?
That's a really great question. So, so cities represent sort of the problem and the solution at the same time. We know that cities, essentially by developing in a compact way, that population is essentially more compact around the globe, that is a more efficient use of land, right? So, everybody hears about suburban sprawl, low density development, that then, requires a far more use of the automobile to get around. With cities, if we were to develop in a compact way, it's a more efficient use of space that frees up more land for farms, for food production, for, of course, natural habitat, things of that nature. And I know in Brazil, for example, there's been a lot of struggle with respect to preservation of natural lands, right? Especially in the rainforests and areas of, yeah, right. So that's a sort of short version of the importance of cities. Of course, we love cities. I mean, we're here in Manhattan, and we love that sort of exchange of ideas that cities represent. Cities have this sort of richness of culture, economic development, economic strength, a sort of mix of different populations, right? Demographics, et cetera. So that's the sort of why, I guess we love cities so much as well. But cities are also the problem in the sense that, most of the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, actually come from cities, which is not a surprise because that's where most of the population is located. And also, cities are sometimes tough places to live in. They are difficult to live in for a variety of reasons because, sometimes they're concrete jungles, right, to a certain degree. And also, as the climate is changing, we're getting more storms, we're getting hotter climates, and so cities are not always well adapted to thrive in these kinds of changing conditions. And of course, there's a socioeconomic issue as well with respect to, are cities still affordable? Can people live in these cities? I know New York and other cities are having these kinds of issues as well. But so I would say the cities are really where the action is at with respect to livability, climate, sort of socioeconomics, and they're it's a wonderful sort of subject, a laboratory in which to focus our attention. Of course, New York City is a great platform for this type of research. So.
So we're getting questions from Facebook. Julie is asking, what are some of the weirdest, most unusual ways a city can curb climate change? How would you answer that?
Weirdest ways? Well, one way that we could look at it is, or most unusual, is that we could build in using sequestered carbon, for example. So we could build using materials that have a high content of sequestered carbon, or using essentially natural systems in which to build. So for example, timber is a triple win opportunity because you can actually harvest forest, and I'm not talking about Brazilian rainforest. I'm talking old growth forest. I'm talking about tree farms that essentially we can use to build skyscrapers. And so there's been a lot of opportunity there for new research around technologies. They're essentially disruptive technologies that allow us to essentially leapfrog over mistakes that were made, in, say, the global north. So that's one example. Another one, if you will, is about weird technologies, I suppose, is this interest in autonomous vehicles. So everybody's heard about the autonomous vehicle, but if we were to sort of foster a culture of shared autonomous vehicles, we could potentially have a huge impact on the number of automobiles that actually are choking our city streets. And of course, parking would be less of an issue there as well. So those are sort of two examples of maybe, I wouldn't say weird, but certainly innovative. So I think the important thing is looking at sort of digital, the digital revolution, the Internet of Things, as a sort of potential, having a potential role as a disruptor with respect to how we develop our cities. I think there might be another question there.
Yeah, there's another question there. It's from Jess. She's asking, what energy investment would you promote for a greener New York City?
What energy investment would you promote for a greener New York City? Well, first of all, a post-carbon economy is not going to be an easy economy right away, but it's definitely to be aggressively promoting the reduction of fossil fuels in our energy portfolio for the city of New York, for example, is a natural strategy. New York City, is an example of a city that is quite ambitious with respect to developing in a more sustainable way, and so New York has put forward a plan called the 80 by 50 plan, which is the reduction of our greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. Right,
Yep.
and you know this because we've been working on this. So that's going to require a pretty radical reordering of how we invest in our energy, and so. But there's a lot of options and opportunities there, but it's a question of scalability, really. Yeah.
Maybe you want to talk about other cities that are also taking
so
these kind of action.
Right, and I mean, I know Paris is very involved in developing a plan by 2050 for ultimately getting to either low carbon or zero carbon. Copenhagen is very active in this area as well. There are a number of cities around the world. The tricky thing, of course, is that these cities are already built, and so how do you retrofit some of this to achieve our goals?
There's another question from Facebook. Wendy is asking if permaculture is used in your urban designs.
Well, actually, that's a question I might ask you about, because I know that urban farming, for example, is an area that's of great interest to 21st century urban designers, and permaculture, using greenhouses and a variety of other techniques, is part of a portfolio of solutions. It's not going to be a silver bullet, however, because I think it's fair to say that urban farming will cover a percentage of the population needs in terms of their footprint, the food footprint, because food food, energy, and water are a very interesting nexus, actually, and there's a lot of research being done and interest around this sort of nexus of these three systems. And with respect to food, there's issues around distribution, of course, bringing food from far away. By doing sort of urban farming, certainly would help to carry some of that, or take away some of that burden. But I mean, Luciana, when you did your work, in the Gowanus, Brooklyn, where Luciana did a terrific project with a colleague of hers last semester. They were very interested in the development of urban farming. I mean, how did you? What do you think about it?
I think that's something that needs to be highlighted in the urban farming issue, is that urban farming is more than bringing food production into the cities. It also has the aspect of bringing communities together, because food is something that brings people together. So growing food is something that creates a equality feel in the neighborhood. It kind of creates a owning feeling over the area. So you care more about it. So that's also another side of urban farming that is not just ecological, it's also social.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I mean, I think that there's something to be said about, we talk a lot about resilience, and I think social resilience is a very important element. So, one of our sort of central roles as urban designers is really to foster and reinforce the sort of glue that holds communities together. And I think that that's illustrated by, when a disaster hits, that we're not all sort of fending for ourselves, but we're part of a community, and part of that is around the sort of people-centered public spaces that we try to focus on, right? So I think that's an important element, and I think you're absolutely right on the social resilience question.
So there's something more from Facebook. Alex is asking, what's the role of universities in preparing students to solve the challenges of climate change in urban environments?
What's the role of universities? Great question. That's something that I'm thinking a lot about, because what I feel is that there's already quite a lot of science and a lot of advances with respect to sort of understanding sort of problem, if you will, the challenges. There are a lot of very sophisticated models that are out there. I think the role that many so part of the answer to that is that push forward on that research, on that science, and really start also then to get down to a more granular level, at a kind of city level and even a district level. I think a lot of the research is struggled with sort of this sort of macro, they have terrific models that are sort of operating at a macro level. To get down to the granular level is very important. Having said that, I think that there's not going to be a sort of silver bullet, perfect model, digital model, let's say, that is going to pop out an answer to our much more district level sort of actions. For that reason, I think that there's an important role to be played by universities in the design field to test, to develop prototypes, to essentially, as you said, bridge between the science and the practice, and to work with practitioners around this issue too. So I very much encourage students, and we do this work in our urban climate lab in our second semester, is to choose a particular site and to essentially test out in conjunction, in close collaboration with the scientific community and with the practitioner community, these different kinds of strategies and methods to develop essentially net zero energy, climate resilient urban design project. And I know that Luciana, you're also working with me, and others are working with me on the outreach to the professional community. I'm co-chair of the American Institute of Architects here in New York City in the the Planning and Urban Design Committee. And so I'm working with some fantastic colleagues who are practitioners, leading firms, leading global firms here in New York City. And it gives a chance for them to bridge actually to the kind of research work that we're doing here as well. So there's a sort of symbiotic relationship that is being developed, and I think, well, Luciana, why don't you just say what you're working on?
Yeah, I was going to mention that when you started talking about universities. I think one good, important side of thing about universities is that making this bridge between science research and what is applied in what we call sometimes real world, which is practicing urban design. Like first semester here when we first started and we talk about it and we read a lot, but sometimes it feels like it's not really happening or these actions are not really being taken. And when you start bridging outside of university with real professionals, you understand that these things are being discussed, and it's still, everyone is still struggling with these issues. I mean, it's
Absolutely.
There's no right answer. So I think this is also an important side of university. And also I think stimulating local research, not just books and articles, but going to places and seeing how things work there. That's also something that we're super stimulated here. And
yeah, and I mean,
it's super useful.
I think one example of that is the work that you're doing with the American Institute of Architects with respect to the net zero eco districts. Maybe just kind of say what's the kind of big idea there.
Yeah, so I started going to the AIA meetings, and in the beginning I was just listening to these experts over there. But at some point you notice that you can get involved, and actually students can really contribute to that. So what I'm doing now is I'm involved with the Aqua District group, and we're trying to develop like a mock-up of an Aqua District in New York City, like a carbon zero district, net zero. I mean, we're still struggling with the definition, but a sustainable neighborhood or community here in New York, and it's really interesting to make this bridge.
Yeah, and it's very compelling, obviously, to the practitioner community.
Another question from Facebook. What is the role of private sector in combating climate change? What kind of incentives can cities offer to ensure that green infrastructure and zero carbon emission strategies are being implemented with development? Wow.
Very good question. The private sector has an incredibly important role to play here. First of all, I think with respect to incentivizing sort of best practices with respect to the private sector, this we can really be creative here by using real estate and using the value of land in such a way to incentivize, for example, linear parks. How might that work? Well, there's this notion of potential transfer of development rights, for example, where you can identify critical zones that are perhaps either vulnerable zones with respect to flooding, or zones that are perhaps could be set aside to sort of develop linear corridors for natural ventilation in the heart of the city, and at the same time perhaps allow for bonus development to occur in sites that are nearby. So you could sort of attract investment dollars with respect to that, for sure. In addition, I think there's a lot that the private sector gains from sustainable development. I'll just give a couple of examples. One is that if we were to develop, say, in the face of a changing climate, a hotter city, let's say, we were able to develop a microclimate that's more desirable, more comfortable, let's say, and more healthy, that's going to actually reduce energy loads at the building level. Think about it. The surrounding climate is getting hotter, hotter, hotter. What is the answer to that? Well, put in more robust air conditioners. More robust air conditioners require greater. They're going to have to cool the building more. It's going to cause more money, of course, because the energy to cool is going to be greater. But at the same time, the waste heat that comes out of the buildings is going to exacerbate this very problem. So you're actually going to continue to heat up the cities through this waste heat, at the same time using the energy for cooling. In addition, of course, health is another major factor. So there's the money and there's the health. They've got being very sort of black and white about this. So the money is with respect to what I've just talked about, and the health, of course, is that hotter cities are less healthy cities. There are, of course, vulnerable populations that are more susceptible, elderly and children, for example. But even office workers who are in the central business district need to be in a more healthy environment. That's good for not only for business, but it's actually good for the population with respect to. And then lastly, I would say that there's a huge economic incentive to developing new technologies, new building materials that could be low carbon. Think about, I've told you about this in classes, that if you think about the amount of development that has happened up until now to develop cities, something on the order of 3 times more development will need to be, is being envisioned, especially in the global south, with this mass urbanization. So cities are being built daily, and the question is, how do we build those cities? And so there's an enormous amount of, I guess you could say, economic development or money that would be involved in the building of these cities. The question is, what kinds of technologies, what kind of methods are we going to be using to do this? And this is where I think the importance of our work is centered.
So one more question from Facebook. Lib asks, in your work and in your teaching, do you collaborate with engineers, energy management experts, and others?
Absolutely. I was mentioning with respect to our jury for our urban climate lab here at NYIT in the School of Architecture and Design. We work very closely with urban energy experts, for example, people who have a background in energy and sustainability, which I think there's a blurring that is occurring now, and it's actually a good thing between professions, between sort of sectors. And that is to be actually, I think we need to sort of be grounded in our profession, in our expertise, but I think you're seeing much more of a blurring with respect to the relationship between architecture, MEP, mechanical engineering, energy systems, water experts, and then of course climate experts. Landscape architects, of course, play a huge role. So and biologists, exactly. Yeah. I don't know what you think about that, but that's certainly.
No, I think it's definitely enriching to have different fields of expertise in the same room and discussing. And sometimes we say something that maybe for a climatologist is going to say, no, actually that's not how it works that way. And it's enriching for both sides, because maybe it's the opposite. Maybe they know that something, I mean, in research works that way, but we're like, yeah, but it can't be really built that way. That's not how it works in design field. So it's really good to have everyone in the same room discussing and trying to understand what is the role of each one always, and respecting that. But collaborating is definitely enriching for everyone.
No, I agree.
Even in the AIA, we have different.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Even in the committee where I'm co-chair at the Planning and Urban Design Committee, we don't just have architects there. We have engineers, we have planners, we have policy makers, we have a variety of sectors. Yeah.
So maybe now I'll talk about something that we haven't talked yet, and it's about mitigation and adaptation to climate change.
Mitigation, you mean climate mitigation and climate adaptation?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, those are terms that are used a lot these days. It's important to define them. What would you?
Well, they're two completely different approaches, people say. Adaptation is basically to the climate that is changing, and mitigation is having actions to slow down the greenhouse gas emissions, mostly to slower the development of climate change.
Right.
I'd like you to talk about how can these things be combined together in something that we call adaptive mitigation.
Right.
And how it's and how it's going to be important for the cities in the future.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a natural tendency from like funding sources and the government to focus on either climate mitigation actions or climate adaptation actions. I think it's a natural tendency because this is where funding could be kind of coming from. And so you'll often see city agencies, for example, have a focus on one or the other. Unfortunately, this sort of bifurcation of climate mitigation and climate adaptation is problematic, because I just give an example. Well, I gave an example actually with respect to mechanical systems in the central business district in a hotter city, for example. One way to adapt to a hotter city is just simply to change your
AC
air conditioning system and make it more robust and use it more often. You're adapting to a changing climate. The problem is, of course, is you're sort of creating a cycle of problems with respect to waste heat and making even the city hotter and using more energy and more money. So that's an adaptation. Of course, the famous one is, put the sandbags down, on the edge of the river to prevent future flooding. And that's true, and that's critically important, obviously, with respect to emergency actions. A mitigation strategy might be that, we will, just purely mitigation, we could imagine the fuel that we use for our automobiles has less CO2 in it. Okay, that's good. That's a good thing. There's less emissions, etc. The problem is that we're not getting into the questions of suburban sprawl. We're simply just changing the fuel that goes into these automobiles. Suburban sprawl is problematic because the inefficiency of the roadway system, parking lots, which of course create urban heat island, which I know we're going to get into in a minute.
Yeah.
So that's a sort of bifurcation problem. A colleague of mine kind of coined this term adaptive mitigation, which is essentially win-win. Prioritizing adaptation strategies that also cover mitigation. And examples of this might be emphasizing linear park systems that are prevalent and could be more prevalent in cities. You're seeing this in China, for example, during the whole sponge city movement that's happening there, especially in Shenzhen and elsewhere. And also really if I may point to this poster here, where really we're looking at sort of 4 different strategies here, overall urban climate strategies. Number 1 is really focusing on the efficiency of urban systems. So this is a win-win opportunity for mitigation and adaptation. We are, by reducing the effect of the automobile and the emissions of human-caused emissions, especially in our cities, by developing cities in a more compact way, maybe around transportation systems. We have the possibility for, everybody knows about transit-oriented development. There's also potential for transit-synergized development that a colleague of mine in our chapter in Climate Change in Cities really focused on, where we could develop district energy solutions. So there's some real efficiencies with respect to that compactness. The second here is on form and layout. Form and layout. This is kind of the focus of urban design, of course. It's 3-dimensional urban form, right? How we configure our neighborhoods, how we shape our buildings. We're maximizing summertime ventilation, urban ventilation that uses cool breezes to cool down public spaces. And heat-resistant construction materials, we talked about that with respect to desert environments, for example, where they're maximizing thermal mass, but also reflective surfaces is really critical here to ensure that urban heat island is not as prevalent. And vegetative cover, which of course is another word of saying green infrastructure, which provides not only storm mitigation, but also evapotranspiration from the plants to cool down our neighborhoods. So that's a useful sort of technique. And this is, by the way, central to the strategies in our chapter. For those of you who have not seen it, this is a publication that really sort of uses this as a sort of, especially the chapter on urban planning and urban design, this is sort of foundational to that chapter and sort of organizes that chapter in a certain way. So, and this is by, with Cambridge University Press, so do have a look at the copies. It's on the Cambridge University Press website, Climate Change in Cities.
So unfortunately, we are running out of time here, so we're not going to take more questions.
Already? Wow.
I know.
I don't know. It's like it went very quickly.
But please keep posting your questions there. We're going to be answering them as soon as we can. And we know it's an exciting issue and everybody wants to talk about it. So please make your questions and we'll try to answer them.
Yeah, and I think the contemporary urban design field is a very exciting field right now. It's a fluid and fast-moving and a global practice. So I think that's, and we're very excited to be working with students like you and with all of the collaborators to really develop solutions to some of these problems and challenges that we're facing. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you've enjoyed this conversation. I certainly have. Thank you very much,
me
Luciana.
too. Thank you, Jeffrey, and
Cheers.
thank you, everyone.
Bye.